And I'm going to go ahead and start by, we're going to introduce ourselves. I am Stephanie Herlick. I'm a teacher of the visually impaired and orientation and mobility specialist. And I am the coordinator of the assessment program at California School for the Blind. Shelby is going to introduce herself next.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Hi, I'm Shelby Zimmerman, and I am a teacher of the visually impaired and orientation and mobility specialist on the California School for the Blind Assessment Center team. Rebecca?
And I'm Rebecca Henry. I'm the speech and language pathologist on the assessment team.
Thank you, everybody. So Shelby, myself, and Rebecca, we are the moderators for today. And now we're going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves. So Carol, you are going to introduce yourself first. Let's make sure we unmute Carol.
Okay.
Great.
I'm Carol Evans, and I'm a long ago teacher of the visually impaired who career changed to school psychology.
Thank you. Marnee, would you like to introduce yourself next? Go ahead and unmute first. Hang on 1 second. Can someone help Marnee unmute? There you go.
I'm Marnee Loftin, and I'm a happily retired person. I retired from the Texas School for the Blind after working there almost 30 years. My background was not in BI, so it's really been a steep learning curve, and it's always nice to share some of what I learned in the process with folks.
Great. And Terese.
I'm Dr. Terese Pawletko, and I'm a former TBI as well, and now working as a private practitioner, doing evaluations kind of scattered around New England because I have a blindness and an autism background and a pediatric psychology background. So that's me.
Thank you. And Julie Manning is going to be joining us a little bit into the webinar. She is a school psychologist at California School for the Blind. She's worked with multiply disabled youth and adults for nearly 30 years and has been a school psych at CSB for nearly 20 years. And then May, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Nguyen, and I'm a school psychologist with the California School for the Blind Assessment Center team. We provide assessments for children throughout the state of California, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member for the school psychology graduate program at California State University, East Bay. And I am a recent founder of the Resilient Minds Collective, which is a network of educational psychologists, marriage and family therapists, and school neuropsychologists, where we hope to support individuals with diverse needs to make progress and meet their goals. And I just want to acknowledge that in our audience today, we have many people who have great expertise as well. So we welcome you to share your comments in the chat. One of our expert, who Carol lovingly calls the mother of us all, or the grandmother of us all, is Joan Chase, who was the original TBI who switched over to school psychology. So I just want to acknowledge that there's so many people in our audience who also have great expertise in this area, and we would love for your comments to join us in the chat. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. So we do want to kind of know who's out there. We have a poll that we're going to go ahead and launch. And the questions are, number one, who are you? So you can feel free to select more than one, I believe. So we have TBI, O&M, SLP, psychologist, graduate student, administrator, and other awesome people. So if you're unable to put it into the poll, feel free to put it in the chat if that's easier for you. And then our next question is, where are you? And the choices there are West, Midwest, South, Northeast. That all pertains to the United States. And then if we have any international participants, we would love to know that as well. So we'll take a moment. I'm going to leave this up to Shelby to go ahead and close the poll when it's when we've got There we go. So I am unable to see those results. I will let May, are you able to see those results?
I can see him, Stephanie.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is Shelby, by the way. Let me turn my video on. So results of the poll. Who are you and where are you? 14% are TVIs. The majority are psychologists at 75%. 6%, we have 4 graduate students, 1 administrator, and 2 other awesome people. Where are you? The majority are in the West, 59%, and the others kind of scattered about from the Midwest, South, Northeast, and 2 people international.
Great. All right. Let's see. So we are ready to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to throw out that opening code one more time, and it's learning for anyone that needs it. And again, feel free to, once we get going, put your questions or comments or resources in the chat, and we will do our best to collect those. So I am going to ask, May is going to be our panelist for the first question, and we will go ahead and turn off cameras for anyone who's not answering that question. Okay, so May, the first question is, what is the best approach for an initial and a triennial assessment for a student who is visually impaired? What are the roles of the school psychologist and the VI specialist in a psychoeducational evaluation?
Thank you, Stephanie. And if a moderator could drop into the chat the outline of questions for the audience to have a preview of what's to come, that'd be great. Thank you very much. And so I looked at our registration and saw that we have some people who are beginners, some people who have some experience, and then some people who are quite familiar with assessing students with visual impairments. So if you're just starting out and maybe having your first case coming up where your student has a visual impairment, you might want to check out some foundational knowledge that was provided in our 3 webinars in the month of May 2001, so last month, or sorry, 2021, not 2001. And so Dr. Pawletko, Dr. Evans, they together did collaborative psychoeducational assessments, visually impaired teachers and evaluators working together. The webinar recording and their handout is provided in our resource handout that our moderator will be able to drop into the chat. So in the chat, you will be able to access the questions outlined for today's discussion, as well as the handout, including all the resources. So Marnee also provided a wonderful webinar and handout about collaborative evaluation, working together. And then our CSB Assessment Center team did another 3rd webinar on the same week about the same topic of psychoeducational evaluations of students with visual impairments, including a quite lengthy handout with many resources. So if you're starting out, pick and choose one or multiple of those recordings to view. Our CSB one is quite long. It's about 3 hours. And we did get a feedback in our webinar survey saying, you know, that they appreciated the information that was shared in our webinar, but 3 hours might seem kind of long and daunting. So if you are wanting a quick reference, I highly recommend you go over to APH and look at their intelligence testing of individuals who are blind or visually impaired. That was authored by Stephen Nguyen, as well as Marnee Loftin and Dr. Carol Evans. 2 of them are here with us today, so I'm so happy to have our experts with us. It is a very easy, quick read that I think every psychologist who is working with a student with visual impairments should look over before planning the evaluation. And one common theme between all of our presentations is that you need to be collaborating through the whole evaluation process. Every student with visual impairments is a unique individual. There's such a wide diversity of strengths and skills and needs between students with visual impairments. There is not one set battery that can be used appropriately for all students with visual impairments. So you want to collaborate with your TVI beforehand to see what is the student's visual access, what is their appropriate learning media, and doing this beforehand planning will help to create an evaluation that is meaningful. And after you do your testing, you want to do interpretation with your TVI, talk to them about how the student responded to various subtests, and you might even have your TVI with you during the testing process, especially if you're using some Braille adaptations. So one of our key points that if you take away only a few things from our webinars is please do collaborate with your team members. Your TVI will be your best friend during this evaluation process, and capitalize on the knowledge from them as well as family members. So another vision specialist that you want to be collaborating with is the orientation mobility specialist. So I see that it is time to be moving on to the next question. So please check out those references. That'll be a great starting point if you're new. All right, go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay, thanks, May. So the second question that we have, Carol is going to answer for us. And the question is, when is it okay to use visual stimuli? More specifically, do school psychs complete traditional processing cognitive assessments? How are IQ tests administered to VI students?
Hi. Well, the question I've been asked to address is whether visual items should be used. And that was a question I had years ago, and it was answered by this statement: verbal IQ alone paints an incomplete picture of students who use their vision for learning. And the most profound statement that I've heard about this item is when this gentleman, Richard Russo, one of the first school psychologists that I knew at CSB, was asked why he used the whole whisk, because up to that point, we'd been told just use the verbal. And he said, to document the extent to which performance declines when excessive demands are made on a faulty visual system. And so from that, many of us reasoned that it can contribute to the functional vision evaluation. And you'll see some examples of that in the qualitative interpretations later. Visual spatial items or tests may be used if the individual uses vision for some or all of their learning. Both the functional and vision assessment and the learning media assessment support the presence of adequate vision for specific items. Both the VI professional and evaluator agree that the results provide meaningful information and support the referral question. I think that was all I had on that.
Thank you, Carol. That's wonderful.
Okay.
Feel free, panelists, to give us a little signal if you are done, and we'll jump on and start the next question. So number 3, May, you're up again. You're going to answer this question, which is, what resources, information, and tools incorporate the expanded core curriculum into the evaluation process?
Thanks, Stephanie. So I think that you and Shelby actually did a great job of explaining what tools are available in one of your previous presentations in your what's in your assessment toolbox. And the handout for that presentation is in your resources handout. If you click there, you can see a list of various assessment tools that are typically used by TVIs or teachers of students with visual impairments. However, they might be a good starting spot for a school psychologist to look at what components of the ECC or expanded core curriculum are things that we should look out for when we're doing our RIOT, our records review, interview, observations, and testing. One very awesome book is this ECC Essentials, Teaching the Expanded Core Curriculum to Students with Vision Impairments. Inside are chapters on each of the areas and various examples of checklists or interviews that you can use in your evaluation process for the different areas of the ECC. And so this won't give you any kind of standard score or anything like that, but it will provide meaningful information of where the student is functioning or help guide you in where to probe in your interviews to get more information in these areas. Some other checklists that are available are the Iowa ECC Resource Guide and the ECC Annual Needs Assessment that is from teachingvisuallyimpaired.com. Again, these are more for the TVI to use. However, it can give an idea of what skills might be looked at inside the ECC. And Stephanie, I'm going to throw it over to you if there's anything else you want to share about that.
No, I think that's great. Thank you, May. Okay, we're moving right along. Number 4. And again, this question is for May. What types of accommodations, supports, or tools could be beneficial in a general education setting for students who are visually impaired? What resources can be provided to teachers, parents, students, and special education professionals regarding how to better support a student who is blind or visually impaired in a general education setting? What types of support or direct service might a VI specialist provide a student in a general education setting? A big question. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. So again, I'm going to refer you to our resources handout. There are so many wonderful resources out there that can help guide you when you're thinking about recommendations after the evaluation. When we're doing our evaluation, we want to remember what is one of the key purposes of doing the evaluation is to determine what are the students' strengths and levels of needs and how we can appropriately support those needs with different services or accommodations or modifications that we can include in their program, their educational plan, their IEP, or 504 plan. So if we're looking in the resources handout, you're going to see a link for Appendix D, potential recommendations resources. These include recommendations related to specific eye conditions and general recommendations for students with visual impairments. One of the set of the documents for specific eye conditions includes, it's written for students and young adults who have specific eye conditions. So it's intended for individuals who themselves have visual impairments to review. And then there are also documents that are more geared towards professionals or parents. So on Family Connect, there is a nice article about the central role of the teacher of students with visual impairments that provides a nice primer about what services a TVI can provide. And it's also available in Spanish, which I feel is very helpful for our multilingual friends. Another resource that I provided in the handout is Practical Tips and Strategies for Supporting the Whole Child with Visual Impairments. It's a handout from one of our other webinars that includes ideas and resources for promoting healthy behaviors, routines, supporting learning, supporting mental health, and practicing your own self-care. There are so many resources in the VI community for providing mentorship and supporting students during that transition from their educational career to their independent adult life. One thing that I feel that could be utilized more are these online mentorship connections that really help a student maybe come to terms with their visual disability and adjust to what that might look like in the future as they're pursuing their higher education or their careers. So that's one thing I really want to highlight is those connections can be so key in helping students feel comfortable with moving on with the next stage of their life. Now, in terms of common accommodations or supports that might be available or provided in the general education setting, some things that you might want to include in your IEP if appropriate Remember, there are no blanket statements that should be applied to every student with VI. They should be tailored and personalized based on the evaluation results. But some students might need some explicit teaching for social skills or executive functioning skills, such as organization, planning, and time management. There is a lot of incidental learning that is missed, or the learning through casual observation. So explicit teaching is necessary in some of these areas. Providing concrete examples and using real objects as much as possible. We have a lot of wonderful different tactile graphics and miniatures, but miniatures are not as meaningful as using actual objects. So for example, if you have a play whisk toy that's made of plastic, it's not as meaningful as a real whisk from the kitchen. So using real objects as much as possible is really important, and providing opportunities to learn by doing, providing experiential learning so that students can unify concepts. Sometimes students might have really great memories and be able to tell you verbatim things that they learned in class, but it might not have as much meaning for them since they can just spit back what they've heard, but they're not really sure what it might mean. So for a student, a car might just mean the radio sounds that they hear, the songs that they hear through the radio, and the wind going through their hair as the window is down. But talking about maybe some of the salient features of a car that is used for transportation from point A to point B, it has 4 wheels. And I see that it is time for the next question. So check out those resources. They have more ideas in there about other accommodations and supports for students. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, May. Our next question, and I'll just pause real quick. You can see that these questions are all big topics, and again, we're just touching on them. So hope we're giving you little, more than little, but nuggets of information that you can then run with. So moving on, our next question is going to Marnee, and here's the question. Given the emphasis on visually based and nonverbal tests for eligibility, how do you document eligibility for gifted and talented programs for students with visual impairments?
Okay, I seem to have gotten all the ones I could talk about per day, so I will try to fill up every minute of my time. I think one of the things that I always do first when I get these questions about the gifted and talented programs is to really sit down and talk to the teachers and to the parents about what their goal is for participation of their child in these programs. Some of the programs are wonderful. You know, they're programs that really focus on problem solving, group activities, a lot of cooperative learning. And others, quite frankly, are things that there's a lot of busy work. It's just adding an additional level of homework onto a child who may well be struggling with the homework that is available. So I think it behooves us as child advocates to sit and talk about the actual reasons and how good a match it is for the child. That given, and if we decide that it is a good match for the child, if everyone seems to be in agreement, I think that what we need to do is to, again, remember why school districts develop these criteria for people to enter into these programs. The idea was to admit children who were not necessarily the best students in the classroom, who didn't have the information that they could recite on prompt, but those kids that had the ability to be creative thinkers. And so they have come up with a whole lot of things, visual analogies. Y'all all know the different types of things that are supposedly culture fair and allow all children an equal opportunity. So what I tended to do and recommended to other people, at least in Texas and the other states where I've worked, is that they sit down and that they write a letter to the director of the program in terms of the admission, specify the ways in which these instruments were clearly not valid and not appropriate for children with a visual impairment. I think the directors have always thought about those issues with children who are totally blind, but they have not thought about it in connection with children who have low vision. So trying to point out the difficulties with that, and then again, suggesting to the administrators an alternative way to assess the skills of these children and the appropriateness of the placement. You'll find if you look in your resources at the end that there is a checklist that I included, as well as a fairly long section on gifted and talented programs that's included in the Making Evaluation Meaningful book that I wrote many years ago and which is being revised. But I think this information is still good. It again talks about whether it's appropriate for everyone. And then it gives a very how well does the child get along in a group? How good at they are problem solving? Just a lot of personality characteristics that tend to be associated with children who are gifted. My experience has been those are the same characteristics you see in children who are visually impaired. They go across all different kinds of children. So I think sharing the results of that informal checklist with directors. My experience, in addition to those checklists, is that they want some sort of a more objective assessment. My experience again, and for a number of years, we had a specific camp that was with gifted and talented children. I felt as though the best objective measure that we had was the comprehension subtest of the WISC. It's a subtest that frequently you'll see that BI children do not do well on because it tends to measure their experiences in the world. It's not things that you necessarily learn in school, but it does provide a pretty good measure of how often they're able to participate in just general life experiences. So I suggest that is a score that can be offered, again, with all the usual cautions that we give anytime that we use one of those scores. And again, being aware that it is simply one particular part of a subtest. But that in conjunction with the information from the checklist has seemed to be a very successful alternative assessment. I don't believe that I've ever heard a district turning that down. Again, they want to be inclusive of children who are visually impaired. They're just not sure how to do it. And this offers a good alternative. One last thing, I see the faces appearing and I'm always long-winded, I apologize. The thing that is not a good one is the vocabulary scores. Every spring you'll get an onslaught of people saying, this child is gifted because they have a great vocabulary. And as we know from the different things that we'll talk about over time, that's not a good measure for young children. They may use words that they don't have the actual meaning. So that's my thoughts.
Great, thanks, Marnee. Moving on to number 6, and this is for May. What's your opinion on the Loftin Intelligence Test, 4th edition, the SIT-4?
Thanks, Shelby. And this is a question that has come up multiple times in our various webinars this school year. I believe that people might gravitate towards the Loftin since it is stated that you can use it with students who are blind or visually impaired. But I do want to let you know that I was able to have a nice conversation with one of the Loftins. It's actually a family business. So I was able to talk with Stephen's Loftin and communicate with some of their team members about their perspective. And I just want to highlight that in their administration manual and in their technical manual, there is a lot of information. And on the first page of the administration manual, it clearly states that Loftin did not intend that his instrument would be used as a diagnostic instrument to compete with other cognitive tests that are more comprehensive, such as the WIS-5 or the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scales, the 5th edition. The SIT was designed as a screening instrument to provide useful information about a client's verbal cognitive ability and help determine if a more thorough evaluation would be needed. And so when we're looking at the SIT-4, it's more intended just as a screening instrument, and it can be used in conjunction with a battery of other tests that might corroborate the strengths and weaknesses that you might see through the SIT-4 subdomains, but it cannot be used alone as the sole criterion for differential diagnosis. And for placement purposes, the authors and publishers do not recommend using the SIT-4 as a sole criterion for placement for programs, including for the gifted or talented or GATE programs. Just like Marnee was saying, we should not just rely on this one measure of verbal ability. There are different modifications or adaptations for special populations with the SIT-4, including some tactile crack and peel labels. Dr. Carol Evans actually was able to sample some of these and try them out. They were also field tested with some others, including Dr. Larson in Nebraska, tested them out. And so these crack and peel labels were used to modify some of the items like counting apples and things like that. So there are modifications that you can use, but if you're looking for other tests that have adaptations or modifications that are really available, other ones that you might want to consider are the WJ or Woodcock-Johnson tests. They have the cognitive abilities, oral language, and achievement tests. They have, I'm holding up right now, one of the large print manuals. You can see it's much bigger than our standard easels for the WJ. I'm just going to show an example of one of the pages of the visual stimuli. Is much larger. You can see with my face for comparison of size, it is a lot bigger than our standard manual. You can also use the WJ is available in a Braille adaptation. And Shelby, I see I done with my time, but I want to share a few more things. It's going to be a little bit like Marnee. The BAME also is a test that you can use for basic concepts. You can use it with students who are younger or who might be functioning in the earlier levels of development. They have embossed pages. I hope you can see where different shapes are pushed up on these pages that students can feel tactily. And there is also the organ project. So for the WJ, BAME, and the SIT-4, the standard numbers that you would get, you have to consider that the scores are for the original sets for like the WJ and for the BAME. It's not a score that was produced in the norming process for these adapted versions. For the Oregon project, you do not get a standard score. However, this was made specifically for students with visual impairments and can provide much more meaningful information than some of our standardized assessments. I feel that a lot of times when we're evaluating, people may focus very heavily on standard scores, but are those scores really meaningful for our students? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with some of our other panelists, but we want to really see when we're looking at the results of our evaluation, what can the student do? How can we show their level of competency and their level of independence in showing those skills? And I know I'm going way over my time, so Shelby, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks, May. Moving on to question number 7, and this is for Marnee. What process would you use to determine the presence of SLD, including specific instruments that would be most helpful in this process?
Okay, this is another biggie, and it's really a full day workshop at best. Carol's going to talk in a little bit about some of the misunderstandings about the whole process of determining the presence of a learning disability. I guess what I wanted to start with is the idea that if you look at the national figures in terms of different eligibility categories. SLD is by far the biggest. You know, it's got about 34 to 35% of the students in special ed are in special ed because of a learning disability. And yet it's something that is very, very seldom diagnosed in children with a visual impairment. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is misunderstanding of the language and this belief that somehow it says rule out, which Carol will talk about. But I think the other thing is there's kind of a mystery myth about children with visual impairments, that they're 2 years behind. And so I will hear parents, I will hear just regular ed teachers talk about the fact that you don't expect children with a visual impairment to be on grade level, that you expect them to be 2 years behind, which does a terrible disservice for these kids, because by the time we finally get concerned about it, they are far behind and very, very discouraged. I think the third reason for this underestimate is that there's a real misunderstanding about the role of the teacher of the visually impaired. I've never been a TVI, but there is this belief that a TVI should be able to deal with any problem that a child who has a visual impairment has. And the reality is that very few of these teachers are trained in reading intervention and any type of real specialized intervention. The best programs are those that are conducted with a reading intervention specialist, for example, and a TBI working together, but you can't have one without the other. I think if you look at what you need to have as a process for determining the presence of an SLD, it's really important that it be a systematic process, because that's the way that you determine that vision is not the primary reason for it. And so what I have tried to do is to very briefly outline the process that we should follow, in my opinion, to determine the presence of a learning disability. I think the first time is doing a really good review of the history. Determining, has this child had appropriate intervention? Did it occur early? Has it occurred regularly? And critically, with a lot of these children, have the children been healthy enough to benefit from the instruction? Again, if you look at the history, a lot of times you'll see multiple surgeries, multiple hospitalizations. And so I think we need to take that into account in determining whether or not they've had appropriate intervention. I think we also need to look at where the child is academically. Again, going back to that idea that they're supposed to be 2 years behind, a child needs to be pretty much functioning on grade level by the time they hit the second grade, and definitely by the third grade. You know, it's not a never-ending course of being behind everyone else. What I have seen just anecdotally over the years is that people start becoming concerned when the child hits about 5th grade. And everyone becomes aware that middle school is looming and this child is functioning on maybe the 2nd grade, and they're all panicked. But until then, what often happens is that the decision is made that the TBI is not having enough time with the child. So they increase the level of services, or that it's not the appropriate media. So they switch a child from large print to Braille. So there's a lot of things that have happened, but it's not necessarily been the good ones. No later than the 5th grade, I think, is the time that you should be looking at the presence of a learning disability. When you look at the presence of a learning disability, I have found that most commonly we're looking at a reading comprehension or basic reading seems to be the one that most of us feel most comfortable in trying to determine the presence. I think there's 2 reasons that written expression and math tend to be a little bit more complicated, and that we try to avoid them, whether or not we're conscious of it. I think written expression, there's a lot of things that for a low vision child, capitalization, punctuation, for a Braille student, spelling, those are all things that are really kind of associated with a visual impairment. So it takes a little bit longer to get past those mechanics and into the substance of what they're writing. Math is another one that to me is very, very difficult when you're looking at a referral and trying to decide what to do. A lot of math, as you get on up into upper math, is based upon tactile concepts, things that you can't see, can't do things with. So it gets to be a little bit trickier to determine whether or not it's a learning disability or just the lack of that very sophisticated instruction that's required for teaching math concepts to students. So again, the most likely evaluation that you're going to be doing as you look through this history is one for a reading. When I look at a process, we start off with looking at the history. The next thing is looking at the interventions that have occurred. The TBIs that I worked with, it was kind of a learning process for them to understand that, again, part of our saying this is not primarily the result of a vision problem is being able to say we've tried XYZ interventions that are designed for kids who have particular learning difficulties or struggling readers, I guess is the better term. There's two excellent curricula that are available for children with a visual impairment. One of them is the Wilson Reading Program that's available from APH, and it's got a Braille, contracted, uncontracted, and a large print version. And those are excellent things for teachers to start off as a reading intervention. The other one is a book that right now I'm blanking on the name of the book, nor did I include it in the resources, but I will. And it is this incredibly comprehensive intervention strategies for teaching Braille to struggling readers. But the teachers have got to show something that they have done to deal with it rather than just refer them straight for testing. When I do a learning evaluation, in addition to the history, in addition to looking at the interventions, I do a lot of observations. I do interviews with the children and with the teachers. I do informal and I do formal evaluations. So it's a multi-tier process. I'm looking at my watch because I tend to be long-winded. I want to talk a little bit about the things that you look at when you're observing a child in a classroom. I think the things that I look at is, are they an organized child? Are they constantly struggling to get the papers out on time? Are they there with everybody with the materials that they need? Are they using the adaptive devices? Those are all important pieces of, is this a learning disability or just a failure to implement things? How well are they listening for instructions? If that's a problem, then there's different instruments that I would use. How well are they using the accommodations that are available? Again, I'm thinking about problems that you see frequently when you're observing. There's a lot of kids, particularly as they get older, that they have the accommodation of additional time, but they absolutely refuse to use it. They don't want to be the last one through, so they're zipping through the work. And that's kind of another issue. It's not a learning disability. There are several mini checklists that are available to use as an observation tool. There's many interviews that you can do with teachers and parents that they can provide that same type of information. Some that I use frequently are the brief, the behavioral rating, behavioral inventory of executive functioning. There's a couple in the book, Making Evaluation Meaningful, that are specifically designed for children with a visual impairment. Some of the scales, like the BASC, Behavioral Assessment System for Children, has got some items that deal specifically with the behaviors associated with learning disabilities. So again, you're putting all of these things together. The behavior of a child with a learning disability is not significantly different for a child who's visually impaired as opposed to a child with vision. A lot of those things are very, very much the same. I do interviews with children. Oh, are we already out of time? I'm so sorry. Okay. I said it was a full day. So let me tell you the instruments, and then I guess I mistimed. One of the instruments that I like that's an informal one is the qualitative reading inventory. It gives you reading passages on all different subject areas. It gives you, the child has the ability to retell the story. You ask questions, both factual and inferential. So it's an excellent instrument to get that informal base on reading. The other things that are available that I think are great, the Woodcock Johnson, that's available in Braille, large print, through APH. It calls for the ancillary examiner of the TBI being there beside the person to help, so that you know the reason that the student missed the answer. And another one that I have used frequently is a diagnostic achievement battery. I feel like you need two instruments, and the diagnostic achievement battery is one that the School for the Blind in Texas participated in a little of the initial research. So there's some DI kids that are included, but it's one that's pretty easily adapted in Braille and in large print. And it gives you, I think, pretty good information. So my apologies. I timed it 100 times, but I'm more long-winded on a screen, I guess.
It's all great information, Marnee. Thanks. But we do have to move on. We'll keep going with number 8, and this is for Carol. I would like to learn more about the rule-out factors and considerations for assessing a student with VI for a suspected specific learning disability. How do you factor in vision disability exclusionary factors of SLD eligibility into your assessments of VI students? I'm also interested in learning when to suspect or consider assessing for SLD. When would you make the determination that a VI student also has SLD dyslexia?
Well, that's a multi-part question, and I'd like to apologize for leaving out some things when I was covering visual stimuli, but one of the most important things is that whatever adaptations are used in the testing need to be documented in the report, and to remind everybody that miniature objects don't necessarily represent the real thing unless the student has experience with both. But getting to the LD question, there are risks to not considering the implications of the vision impairment on the assessment process and interpretation. At one end of that continuum is attribution of all learning and behavior problems to the vision loss, ignoring other needs. At the other end of the continuum, attributing of nothing to the vision loss, underestimating cognitive ability, inappropriate classification and inappropriate placement. And if you combine, even if there's not a significant discrepancy between the verbal and the visual portions of the test, on the scores on those portions, there's no way of knowing how much higher the visual score would be if the child didn't have a visual impairment. So, and then under the old discrepancy method, combining those scores into a full-scale IQ disadvantages the student because they won't have the discrepancy that they needed. And even under patterns of strengths and weaknesses, I think my feeling on this is, and I've talked with other people, is that no formulaic process is adequate to determine this for a visually impaired child. I think it needs to be a team decision, taking all the data into consideration, and whether students have had their appropriate media while they've been learning print, if they've had it at the right size. I remember, and you'll see pictures in the slides when you get to look at those, that show how a visual item can look to a visually impaired person, and what solutions there are for that, including during testing. Now, the federal regulations have a list of disorders that are not included. Specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of mental retardation, of emotional disturbance, or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Well, a lot of that makes sense, but the operative word there is primarily. And I've had so many psychologists when I was a TVI say, well, you can't have a VI and a learning disability at the same time. You can't have dual eligibilities. Well, Texas allows a whole list of disabilities on the IEP. Utah allows only one primary disability, but it allows you to suggest other things in the report coexisting. Now, the language of the regulations should be amended to say, this is not to say that a learning disability cannot coexist in a child with a visual impairment or any of these other things. In fact, children with neurologically based visual impairment are at increased risk for learning disabilities. And the outcome of the evaluation should support children with blindness or visual impairment in the mainstream setting if the general education setting is appropriate. Generally speaking, the evaluation, any specific test scores, particularly on visual items, should not be used as the sole determinant of cognitive abilities, the presence of additional disabilities, and if intellectual disability is suspected, there must be an adaptive behavior measure, and I've seen kids classified as IDU on basis of an IQ score, and that should never be done. And even though adaptive expectations are different qualitatively for visually impaired students, it is useful for blind and visually impaired students to estimate their independence skills. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carol. Right on time. Appreciate it. Moving on to number 9. This is for May. What are the findings from current research on dyslexia and Braille?
Thanks, Shelby. So just to start us off on this question, a common misconception is that many people with visual impairments use Braille as their reading medium. And actually, if we're looking at some of the latest numbers, it can be quoted that fewer than 10% of people with visual impairments or who are legally blind in the United States actually use Braille for reading. So I just want to throw that out there to increase understanding that not all students with visual impairments will be using Braille. They might be using different assistive technology to magnify or use large print for the reading medium. And Braille is a tactile reading system that's made of 6 dots and a 2x3 dot matrix or a Braille cell. And there's uncontracted Braille and contracted Braille. So there's all these different layers to learning Braille that myself as a school psychologist starting out, I had no idea about. So I just want to throw it out there that there is so much to learn about it, and there's a lot of great resources. But when a student is learning to read Braille, it's a haptic process. You get information from touch, posture, and active exploring movements. There's a difference between reading Braille with one hand or if a student is reading with both hands. And when we're looking at Braille and dyslexia, like my colleagues on the panel here are mentioning, you can have a reading disability alongside a visual impairment. And there are lots of different research happening. Unfortunately, a lot of times the sample size included in research is very small since visual impairments is a very low incidence disability, but some of the conclusions that have been reached through research, and I linked different research findings in your resource handout. There's many out there, but those are just a selection of a few of the more recent ones. While print readers might be able to switch skillfully between graphophonological or orthographic reading strategies when they're looking at different reading materials, they might switch between those different strategies based on the length of words, the type of words, or familiarity. Braille readers are inclined to use constant decoding. So the benefit in reading for experienced Braille readers is achieved through a semantic top-down processing using lexical predictions in a systematic manner. And what I'm referencing is looking for the title, Perceptual and Cognitive Underpinnings of Braille Reading, which is from the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences, Parenting and Special Education Research Unit. And that is the IFL. Oh, and I see I'm out of time already. Oh my goodness. So if you click on that handout and the resources, you can see a lot more information. But I just want to emphasize again, just like Carol Marnee says, that just because you have a visual impairment, that does not exclude you from the possibility of also having a reading disability. All right, so I'm gonna hand it off to the next panelist. Thank you.
Great, thanks, May. Moving on to question number 10, and this is for Terese. What should be included in an assessment battery for a student with VI and suspected autism? How could you distinguish between VI, e.g. blindisms, and autism spectrum disorder features?
Take it away, huh? First of all, please, 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 please avoid using the term blindisms. It is a huge contributor to confusion in terms of autism, autistic-like behaviors in children with vision impairments. It's really a misnomer, because if we're talking about the repetitive behaviors, rocking, flapping, eye poking, head rolling, and so on and so forth, we're talking about stereotypic or repetitive behaviors or mannerisms. And those repetitive behaviors go across populations. So it's not just dedicated to or associated with blindness. It goes into the cognitively impaired population, severely and profound multiple disabilities. So please avoid at all costs using the term blindisms. The thing in terms of determining whether they're associated with autism or not is we really have to think about autism as a multifactorial disorder. Autism includes the social communication difficulties developing and maintaining social relationships, difficulties with change and transitions, and also a need for sameness or preference for sameness, and a lot of sensory sensitivity. So it's the whole cluster of behaviors that defines autism. And that's how you tease out, are the mannerisms associated with those other factors of social relatedness, communication, need for sameness, difficulties with change, and the sensory sensitivity. So please think of it as a cluster, not just focusing on the behaviors and calling them either blindism or autistic-like, because it just really muddies the water and makes it very confusing. And even going into early literature, when I was first getting into the autism and blindness, and I came into that by being the teach intern, having been a TDI ages before, the literature was really focusing on behavior managing out those stereotypic behaviors in the vision population without looking more holistically or globally at those other features. And some of the children that were being reported out on in literature, in fact, likely had autism because of the nature of their visual impairments, which is optic nerve hypoplasia and other features. In terms of a battery, assessment battery, I always go with developmental history, really important to interview people. I use the autism spectrum rating scale, and often what's confusing or kind of muddies the waters a little bit is there's a lot of references to eye contact in the autism related checklist. If we substitute orients body in the direction of speaker, that's really what eye contact is we're orienting to, we're paying attention to by nature of our body language. So think about substituting that statement for eye contact. I use the social responsiveness scale, second edition. I do use parts of the ADOS, though we can't score it. And we also have to assume that the children have had some exposure to some of the toys. And sometimes I just spend time presenting the toys to the children independent of considering it as an item administration. We cannot score an ADOS on a child with a vision impairment. It was never developed for that purpose, but I have used it with children with low vision to get additional information. I use the BASC-3 that has a developmental social component on it, or a scale. I try to use cognitive measures if possible, and definitely the adaptive behavior measures. So that's kind of my cluster. And then it's a lot of observing the children. If I'm going in to do a one-shot evaluation, I'm often asking people to collect video tapes in advance of my going to Connecticut or Rhode Island or wherever I'm traveling to see the children for an evaluation of trying to rule out autism. Because to just see a child once or twice does not adequately capture the challenges or the difficulty in terms of teasing out autism and from a vision impairment. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Terese. And our next question is also for you, and is going to continue on the thread of assessment. And this is a big question with 3 parts, starting with, since we can't get a full scale IQ for many of our VI students, especially our totally blind, how do you identify students with ID or qualify them for modified state assessments? Is it possible to determine if a student has an intellectual disability without a score? Second part is, are there any assessment batteries you recommend for students with vision impairment and other disabilities, such as limited oral communication, challenges with 2-dimensional props, cognitive delays, or motor impairments? And the third part is, what adaptive behavior measures do you suggest using for students with VI suspected of having an ID as well?
Gee, thanks, Rebecca.
We're going to give you a few extra minutes.
How many months have we got? So I'm gonna try to lump those all together and kind of talk about them a little holistically and specifically. So the first question is going to be just in terms of what do we do in terms of not getting a full scale IQ? That is something that often developmental disability agencies require. And what I've tended to do is I tend to do several cognitive assessments, knowing that it's limited because we're limited to working memory tasks and verbal scales. But what I will, and if it sounds like the child is just engaging, basically regurgitating, it's not a diminishing of the children, but they're giving back verbatim responses, that suggests that they've memorized that, and it can be suggestive of that difficulty with processing language and flexibility. But and within the resources, there's an example of a letter that I wrote in reference to another student that had ID, had a significant vision impairment, also had optic nerve hypoplasia. But I wrote specifically that we can't calculate a full scale IQ, that to try to do so, because it would require administering visual, perceptual, and fluid reasoning kinds of tasks, which are visually demanding, or the processing speed, which also is a visual motor demanding task, that it would be discriminatory, and it would be testing more the visual impairment as opposed to an actual cognitive dimension. So I basically write that we can't develop or get a full scale IQ for those reasons, and then I'm relying on the verbal reasoning and the working memory and an adaptive behavior measure. And that's how I'm justifying the identification as ID, and also getting modifications in terms of state assessment batteries. I think that was the other question. I guess it's probably when you have to do profile or portfolio kind of assessments, but that's worked with adult populations for both rehab and developmental disability agencies, and also the schools. So that's how I've managed to get around the full scale IQ issue. And I think it's really important to have some pat statements along those lines. In terms of assessment, the kinds of assessment batteries, with any evaluation, I think Marnee mentioned something along these lines. We really want to clarify, or it might have been May, we really want to clarify what questions folks want answered as a result of the evaluation, because we should really not be focusing so much on scores, even though the state's requiring them. It's really, the bottom line is we want to have things that result in adequate and appropriate programming for the children. So we want to make sure that we're defining, the nature, what's going to kind of define our assessment based on assessment questions that the team wants answered. Whenever possible, we want to make sure that we're using a team approach, because just one person looking at the child does not adequately capture the complexity of the child with the multiple disabilities, whether they have a language impairment or other facets. For children with limited communication skills, consider completing a communication matrix. That was originally developed by Rowland and Schweigert, and it's available, it's free, it's online, and it's just called communicationmatrix.org, but it gets at pre-symbolic communication among other data. So that can be really useful. May held up the Oregon project. That goes up to age 6, but it can be used with folks that are functioning at a lower level. There she goes. Thank you, May. This is the Vanna view. But the Oregon project has multiple domains. So it has like social communication, fine motor, gross motor, daily living skills, and it's a criterion reference measure. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a Brigance, but it's more in depth. But it gives a tremendous amount of information. You're not going to get scores. You can do, get profiling in terms of the types and the levels and the numbers of skills that the children have got, whether they're emerging, whether they've been mastered. But it's really an incredibly helpful tool to have. Some folks have used the ABLES, which is often used with folks with autism spectrum disorders. But again, it's a really detailed profile of various skills. Sometimes using something like in terms of conceptual development, this Southern California ordinal scales, which is based on Piagetian model, but you get some information in terms of conceptual development in that population of children. May also held up the BAME basic concepts. That's available for those that are working in the vision field on quota funds. But it's the 3rd edition. It's K to, kindergarten to 2nd grade, and it quickly assesses kids' basic understanding of 50 basic concepts that can be used for instruction, problem solving, classroom routines, and activities. So there is the BAME 3, and it has those thermoform elevated pages for evaluating kids' conceptual development. So there you see it again. Thank you, May. Where would I be without you? In terms of measures of adaptive behavior, the 2 most commonly used, but they're not geared for kids with vision impairments, are the ABAS, the Adaptive Behavior Assessment System 3, and the Vineland 3. They have, you have to take those, the vision impact into account, because the Vineland 2 actually had, I think it was the Vineland 2, actually had a subgroup for kids with vision impairments, but it was developed on folks with that were living in the residential school, so it was somewhat limited. There's also something called the Scales of Independent Behavior 2, and they had a version that removed the visually dependent items. I don't know if it's still available. But something that May introduced me to, which was new to me, is the Michigan Department of Education Independent Living Skills Checklist for Low Incidence Disabilities. It is free. It is downloadable. You can type in, unlike most PDFs, this one actually allows you to type in it's a fabulous instrument. So thank you, May, for introducing me to that. But you can type in the data, and it actually earmarks when the skills should be developed, like K, preschool, primary grades, and so on and so forth. It goes all the way up through adulthood. So she's showing you some of the pages, but it is fabulous. It has even managing your household kinds of things. So it can go for the whole age range. Completing a preference inventory to see what kinds of things motivate or enable a child to sustain engagement would be really important, and for programming and program development. interviewing the staff that are working with the children, therapists that are working with the children, and of course the parents, and conducting multiple observations. It's really incredibly important for us to get to see the children across as many settings as we can. And the therapists, being able to provide input in terms of how to position children if in fact we're doing formal evaluations, where the TBI to help with the vision gaze and scanning and so on and so forth, and the physical therapist to help with positioning and posturing with a child that may have cerebral palsy. But those are the kinds of things that need to go into a comprehensive assessment with a child with multiple disabilities. It's really a whole team approach, or a village, as it were. So that's it in a nutshell. This is another two-day workshop at least. So thank you.
Thank you, Terese. That was amazing. And all right, our next question is for Julie. So Julie, can you share some tips for working with and assessing a deaf-blind student?
Thank you, and hi, everybody. So a lot of what you've already heard can be considered when assessing a deaf-blind student. I guess some of the things that I wanted to note as your, just for your information, if you're working with someone who's deaf-blind, is that I want everyone to make sure that they consider someone who's deaf-blind. It's one word, and it's not just somebody who's deaf and somebody who's blind. Deaf-blind itself is its own individual category. And it's got its own individual and unique characteristics and learning styles. So often people just put the word together, look at the word and think that it's, like I said, just a deaf person, just deaf and blind, and they have different skills. And we need to look at different things. In fact, the spelling of it has changed several times, and actually, depending on the resource, you'll see that it's still spelled multiple ways in order to reflect the fact that it's its own unique disability category. Most places are combining it to say deaf-blind as one word. If you are referring to deaf-blind as a medical terminology, then it's both the D and the B for deaf-blind would be lowercase. And if you're referring to a deaf-blind person in terms of their culture and themselves as an individual, then the D and the B are capitalized. And this is information that I had to kind of look up. I was exploring and just found the information. I didn't realize even the capitalization. I wasn't sure why sometimes we capitalized it and sometimes we didn't. A couple other important things I really want people to know, and I'm going to say the first one, it's the most important, even though I'm going a little bit out of my order, is that somebody who's deaf-blind, especially in the schools, has what they call an intervener. And it's so important that you all as school psychologists know that it's not the same as someone who's interpreting. An intervener is actually somebody who works to bring the sighted world to the deaf-blind student. Now, there is, depending on the student, there's also, in part, them bringing the hearing world to them as well. Sometimes you'll hear the intervener referred to as a support service provider, and that's actually a different, slightly different position in the schools. I think you're more likely to see an intervener. And also a couple other things. People who are deaf-blind, you want to look into it because often they have either some vision or some hearing or some combination. They still would qualify as deaf-blind and identify as such, but usually if they have some vision or some hearing, that's kind of where, in terms of assessment, we really want to consider what strengths, what areas they do have some skills in. When you're assessing the deaf-blind student, really keep in mind the RIO part of RIOT, right? You want to really do your file review you want to interview, and you really want to observe. And that's how you're going to pull together where the student is at. Again, you've heard all these different strategies for working with students with multiple disabilities. Even though deafblind is a single disability, you still want to utilize some of those strategies. The other thing I wanted to add is, I know I've had some students with a cochlear implant, and I wanted to let you know that just because they have a cochlear implant, that doesn't mean that the hearing is perfectly clear or that it's identical to ours. So yeah. And finally, I encourage you guys who are assessing students who are deafblind, reach out to your states or your local deafblind services. Lots of times the universities have them, and a lot of times they're just through the state. And reach out to them and talk with them. The importance is to do this before you're in the middle of your assessment. And actually, I should say this includes initially reaching out to the teacher of the visually impaired, your TVI, because if they're working with the student, then they're going to be the first group that you really want to talk with. So I think am I actually the first person who's concluding early? Oh, there you go. I was going to say, I do have a bunch of other things.
You have about a minute left if you want to throw anything else in.
Okay, well, so I should be, if I'm not already, I should be on the list of people that you're welcome to call. And I am at California School for the Blind. So if you're in California and you want to talk about your student with a visual impairment, we've got a couple psychologists who are able to speak with you. And then, deafblind is an area that I have really learned to love working with as a school psychologist at California School for the Blind. And so I'm happy to speak with you. I would say email is probably the best way to reach me. I don't know that I consider myself an expert. I wouldn't say that, but I don't know how many experts in deafblindness who are school psychologists there are. So I'm at least a resource. So there you go. Rebecca, you can take it away. Do you have anything to add, since I know you came to us from a deaf school?
I did, but you did, or I did come from a school for the deaf, but you did a great job, Julie. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and our final question is for Carol. Carol, could you please give some examples of the language you would use in your evaluation reports?
Okay. Well, you will find in your materials some presentation slides that Terese and I used in our recent webinar. And we have some caveat statements that we put at the beginning of the report. And so this is kind of a combination of Teresa's caveat and mine. There are no measures developed for children with visual impairments. Therefore, the child's performance is being compared to the sighted population on which this measure was developed. The results should be considered conservative estimates of the child's cognitive abilities, given their life experiences have been different from birth than those in the normative group. Precise determination of the cognitive and academic ability level of individuals with visual impairments is particularly challenging. It's necessary to interpret findings in this report with caution for two reasons. The instruments used were standardized on a sighted population, and certain adaptive procedures were required in administration to allow for access to the materials. And these may include using enlargement, or there was a time when we had to enlarge things on enlarging copiers, and I was really grateful, being one of these old people, that they ever came into existence. But we now have video magnification, and you'll see examples of the machines that do that in the materials that you have. Braille and tactile representations, and also scoring without bonus points for rapid completion. And there are examples of qualitative interpretation in your materials. And I will I think it just occurred to me while preparing for this that probably picture completion is a good one to use as a screening device. So I'll just give you this one example. At some point, it may be necessary to decide whether to continue to attempt to administer items with visual stimuli. For example, Arthur persisted in calling the sample item on the Whisk 5 picture completion a banana because of its color, and he was unable to identify objects in my office unable to identify correctly any other pictures on this or any other subtest. He was unable to identify objects in my office by sight, but was able to identify all of them by touch. This finding suggests a profound limitation in functional vision and supports the functional vision and learning media assessments, which stated that touch is his primary learning channel. It also seems to explain why Arthur is currently having great difficulty in learning to read print. And that's just one of the 7 examples that are adapted from my chapter, Sattler and Evans in Assessment of Children. Thank you.
All right, is that it, Carol?
That's it, unless
right.
you want me to read some more of these.
I would normally love to, but we are just about out of time.
Okay.
So I just want to take a minute to thank everybody for joining us today, especially our panelists and our interpreters. Thank you so much for your time. And our closing code, if you are looking for a proof of attendance or a certificate, our closing code is community. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, if you want to reach any of our panelists, their information is all going to be in the panelist bios, and we'll put that in the chat again in case you can't find it. And thank you so much for your time today.